Well, a couple months ago when I got out of debt, I decided to splurge a little bit on books, and I think I spent $500 on just 3 books, and one of them was this, the Cambridge Ancient History series. I believe there's 16 volumes, and I didn't realize that. I was just going after this one, part 2, Assyria and Babylonia empires and other states from the 8th to the 6th century. As it turns out, there's a whole series. It starts prehistory and it goes all the way basically to the fall of Rome. And working on getting the whole thing. Unfortunately, they're all about 50 or 60 bucks a piece. Some of them are $100 or more a piece. The whole set is like $4,000 or $5,000. I won't be doing that, but I've always been really interested in early history, in Mesopotamia especially, and I'm always kind of upset because there really isn't a great deal of actual history to go with. There's a lot of archaeology, but when you read this, this is interesting because this is talking about 600 or 700 BC, which seems a long time ago here. I mean, that's before classical Greece, but it's amazing how fragmentary the history is. They're concocting entire reigns of kings based on one single cracked clay tablet that indicates that so and so became king and so stopped being king, and they're just and sometimes they find them and they contradict themselves and they don't know. I mean, they'll find one in Babylon and they'll find another one in Assyria and they'll be totally different. And then every once in a while they'll get lucky and they'll find maybe some letters between a king or whatever. But what's really interesting is 600-700 BC. It seems like a long time ago, but the history of the period goes back. I mean, the first city, Uruk, basically became an urban center in 4000 BC. So a full 3,300 years before the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the Neo-Babylonian empires, which, for our intents and purposes, is late or early antiquity. The other thing I really have always noticed whenever I read about this region and this period in history, so I'm talking from before the rise of the Persian Empire, there is an absolute overkill on proper nouns that I just can never get my head around. I remember the first book I read on the Persian Empire, Olmsted's The Persian Empire, which is a classic book on the topic. You will read one paragraph and there will literally be 15 proper nouns in them, either names or states or cities. All of them sound really exotic, all of them sound really strange, and there is literally very often practically no information at all about any of them. So there are kings with really strange names that we just don't know anything about other than somebody said there was a king and they're just taking it as their word. Or we know who their father was, or maybe not, or we know when they came to power, or maybe not, and we know where the city was, or maybe not. And I don't know what it is, but it seems like we're talking about a period really before narrative had been invented. When people would write to each other, they wouldn't recount in detail everything that had happened. Historians and archaeologists have basically pieced that largely together. It's very rare that the written documents are explicit. They say Herodotus is the father of history because really before him, people did not write about history at all, even when they knew some of the past, or at least it seems implied that they did. And so there's a real heavy emphasis on the characters involved in stories, but not the actual stories, and it's very confusing. And I mean, it's tantalizing. You read about some of these places and you just wonder about them, what they were like, what their societies were like, what their economies were like, what their histories were like. And we have like entire states here, which we know that they were big and that they must have had thousands and thousands of people in them, and who knows their own development and everything, and we just don't know anything about them. But anyway, the point of this video, though, that's quite an introduction for the video, is just a little bit of my take on possible origins of the state. Now, I think most historians at this point, and this is probably subject to change at some point, associate the first states with Sumar and Akkad, and specifically with Uruk and Ur. Now, it's possible that there are states that predate this. In fact, there probably are, but this is usually where they get attested first. And if you look at Uruk, which is usually considered the oldest of the metropolitan centers, as I mentioned earlier, that was a settlement for a long time, but it really didn't become an urban center until about 4000 BC. And it's had its ups and downs. And since then, it's currently completely abandoned and has been since about 700 AD. But it had been in decline. It had been in decline by the time the pyramids were built. That tells you anything. But what I think is interesting is that really, if not urban centers, at least very large settlements, towns with thousands of people, predate Uruk and Ur by at least another 4,000 years. You go all the way back to basically the end of the Natufians, 10,000 years ago, or 8,000 BC, and there is evidence of rather extensive towns. How we want to classify them is difficult because these names imply things that may or may not be accurate. So we would say city. We use that for a term for a settlement that has no streets, that has no government, or state, as far as we can tell. To say city, it almost implies that, at least to modern speech. So it's hard to know. But what we do know is that there were large gatherings of people, and that they were permanent, or at least semi-permanent. And actually, contrary to popular wisdom, we now know that large settlements like this predate agriculture by some time. Large settlements developed in the most ideal areas, and then agriculture came to those areas. It wasn't that they developed agriculture and then became sedentary. People basically started to settle in the areas that were most ideal. And interestingly, as far as we know, this was not in the Tigris and the Euphrates Valley, which is usually considered the birthplace of civilization. It is probably the birthplace of states. Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Babylon, Lagash. These are all in the Tigris and Euphrates river deltas. But the actual first big cities, or first towns and stuff, were in, say, Turkey, maybe parts of the Balkans, and also especially in the Jordan River Valley. In fact, it's kind of well known that Jericho had walls around it going back, I think, 7,000 years ago, which would put it 1,000 years before Uruk was a major center. And what's interesting, as far as we know, there weren't any states in these places. So, although it hasn't been really intensively studied, and I don't know that it ever can be proved, one is left with the interesting fact that apparently urban centers existed for a very long time, perhaps as long as 3,000 to 4,000 years, without states, and that states only gradually developed. And one can argue whether that was a good thing or not, but I think the more interesting question is, how did they develop and why? And there's been a couple competing theories. Two broadly based one is the conquest theory, meaning you have an area, foreigners of some type come take it over and they become the state. And that's really popular. When I was a little kid, that was the one that was told to me, actually. This kind of has problems, though, because that would imply that the invading force already had some kind of state. So that would not, that's the chicken before the egg. How can the birth of a state be the conquest by another state? Because then you have to, well, how did the other state get there? All right. Currently, I guess this is out of favor, and people don't tend to look at this, and they look at states as arising internally from within the various societies. And my guess is that they arose out of a form of conservative bias. And what do I mean by that? I don't mean Pat Robertson and Bill Clinton and the Republicans. I mean the idea that people tend to view the current situation as more or less normative. Now, one might ask, well, if that's the case and you have a stateless society, how does a conservative bias lead to a new development like a state? Well, here's the answer. The answer is that these large settlements, which really began in the Neolithic period, and who knows, maybe even the Mesolithic period. I don't think there's any evidence of that, but one of the things that we associate them really with the first time in history is large-scale division of labor. But kind of the cliche is through human history you have hunter-gatherer groups, and more or less each person, if not each group, is a generalist. The men are going to be hunters who make spears and make their clothing, and the women are going to... There's actually a lot of speculation there may have been division of labor between the sexes, but you wouldn't have like one guy who only made spear points and another guy who only made fire and another guy who only cooked and another woman who only sewed. And no, everyone was basically a generalist. And what you start to see in these camps, I don't know what the evidence is, but the consensus seems to be that there was a greater division of labor in these areas. And my guess is that certain people in these within the division of labor, well, let me go back. I think that in a situation like that, what would happen is very often children of somebody would likely move into their position, which is very, very common in history for, you know, the children to do whatever the parents. So the parents are farmers or carpenters or blacksmiths or whatever, then their children will be those things as well, for the simple reason that they would have a comparative advantage. If you grow up and your dad is, say, a bronzesmith, say this is the Bronze Age or the Copper Age, and your dad is a coppersmith, so you grow up, you know, learning about how to smelt copper and also getting arsenic poisoning probably along the way. You're going to know a whole lot more about copper smelting and creating bronze than somebody else who grew up, you know, as a shepherd herding goats, probably. And so the comparative advantage, you would stand to earn the most, even in a pre-money economy, just even in a barter economy, to do what your parents had done. And your parents will likely assist you in this, and then you would probably have all their property too, so you'd get all your dad's tools, and you'd learn all his... So there's a strong tendency for there to be a hereditary division of labor. So father to son, mother to daughter, whatever. And I think that this is what I mean when I say conservative bias, because I think that certain people in these societies got into positions that I would consider proto-state. And there's two in particular. The most common one would be religious leaders. Now, shamanism goes back way before this period, and shamanism, I think, is usually thought to probably be hereditary, at least to an extent, and also would constitute some form of division of labor. So if you have a hunter-gatherer and they have one guy in their band who's the shaman, or one woman, who knows, that's one thing. But my sense of it is you could definitely have a situation where it is considered the way to be for the son of the shaman to be the next shaman. And the other part of this is also self-interest. The coppersmith, if he has a way that his skill set allows him to swindle or defraud the people he trades with systematically without them knowing it, say giving them stuff that's only half bronze or half copper, but that they have no way of verifying that or whatever, and him getting caught on it, then he will do that. And the thing is that's very difficult with actual physical goods, because if you make a copper implement that's only half copper, it will be inferior probably to whatever tasks is set to it. And you might swindle a few people, but very soon it will become obvious that you're swindling. But this is much harder to do in intellectual or non-material services. So it is very hard to show that a shaman is wrong. Usually they know how, and I mean, you see this religion today, and in shamanism today, is the shamans know how to cover their asses and to say things that you could never really pin them on. They'll never make a prediction for, say, well, tomorrow at high noon, you know, a pterodactyl will land. They'll never ever say that. You know, they'll say, oh, it'll be like Chinese fortune cookies. They could mean anything, you know. And so it's very hard. So a shaman could very easily find himself in a position where he is able to defraud people, and there's nothing that they can really pin down. And when I say defraud, I mean he could influence them by saying things, you know, like maybe he could go and get in cahoots with the copper person and tell everybody that they need copper implements to protect themselves from the evil spirits or whatever. And then the copper guy gets rich, and in return he helps the shaman. It would be really hard to prove that the shaman didn't know what he was talking about. So, and if we look at the first states, they have a very high degree of cooperation between the monarchical aristocratic class and the priestly class. And so it is very easy to kind of extend that, well, maybe this is the genesis, you know, instead of the coppersmiths being helped by the shaman, it was some other group, and they became the thing. The other group I think that this is likely is with arbitration. You know, if you have a town with 4,000 people in it, and you have a division of labor, people are going to have property disputes, which the other thing is they usually tend to think of these places as having private property in them. Or even not private disputes, just regular disputes. And what's going to happen is you're going to have arbitration of some kind. And arbitration is almost very, very commonly going to rely on some kind of judge, basically, an arbiter. And that's fine in and of itself, but there can be a tendency then for the arbiter to become something of a legislator, somebody who can basically gives orders that are followed. Now, I don't think that this happens necessarily or right away, but if you have conservative bias and you have an arbiter who has a son, and then what's going to happen is if you don't like the decision of the arbiter, what are you going to do? You're going to go to the goat herder or the dung digger or, you know, the subsistence farmer. They're not arbiters. Everyone's going to say, look, that's the guy who's the arbiter. He's the guy who knows how to arbitrate. Just like they're going to say, that's the shaman. He's the one who knows the will of the gods. Just like if you went to the coppersmith and you thought he screwed you, you wouldn't go to the fisherman and say, fisherman, please give me a copper blade, because the fisherman wouldn't know how to do it. So I think there could be a tendency for the arbiter to say, look, we basically have something of a monopoly here, or a cartel anyway, where who are they going to turn to but us? They don't have a huge choice. These towns aren't that huge where you can have thousands of arbiters, and there's not enough travel going on. There was trade, obviously, even way before this, but to say, well, they don't like my arbitration, they're going to go next door, they might just be stuck with it. And that, because of rational self-interest, would give them an end to say, okay, well, I'm going to arbitrate, and then I'm going to start saying, okay, well, Ugu stole from Mugu, and so he has to pay restitution, but he also has to pay restitution to me because he's wasting my time. And if they don't like it, there won't be arbitration, so they like it. You know, they do it. And next thing you know, he's the fucking king. Now, my guess is that this division of labor and a priestly class and a arbitration class, and I use the term class in a really broad sense, as in there are people who do these, not that they're necessarily institutionalized, going all the way back to as soon as you have towns like this, because you have to have a division of labor when you have a town like that. And like I said, that's going back to the Neolithic. You're talking 10,000 years ago, 4,000 or 5,000 years before Uruk. I think that it took a very long time before any of these, and it could be wrong, it could have been another group, but either the shamans or the arbiters or somebody else, it took a long time before you had something in place where one of them achieved what we would call statehood, where they became somebody who was just owed the position that they had, and that position was one of authority and influence over others, regardless of what they gave. You know, originally, if you didn't like the arbiter, you just didn't go to him. But it comes to the point where you don't have a choice. He is the arbiter, or he is the shaman. He is the will of the gods, or God, or it would be gods back then, I guess. So that's my take on it. I don't know if if it could ever be proven there has to be an answer. It had to happen somehow, so there has to be some kind of theory behind it. That would be my theory. I think that would explain. I think it also might have taken some kind of natural elite person to have done it. Because if somebody was a bumbling fool, I don't think it would have worked. But eventually you have somebody who is so silver-tongued or cunning or inspiring in some other way that they convince the other people that this is all right, and then they have a generation or two where this is still the case. You get to the point, because of conservative bias, where they say, well, he's the arbiter, and his father was the arbiter, and his grandfather was the arbiter, so who am I to say that I should be the arbiter when I'm just a goat herder or whatever? There's a good chance that they won't. And it's good chance if they ever had a dispute, the now hereditary institutionalized arbiter would say, look, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a subsistence farmer. He's a fisherman. I'm an arbiter. My father was an arbiter. His father was an arbiter, and by then he could start making it up, because who would know? And he could say he was the arbiter for 100 generations, and before writing or the internet or the yellow pages, it might be hard to prove him wrong. And and then he'd tell the people, listen, this guy isn't doing what I say, and anyone who takes him down will get his property. And boom, that's how you get a police force and an army. And if you look at the very first armies and stuff, which were relatively small, they were basically just taxing organizations. I mean, they would literally go around. This is before there was even money, and they would just confiscate things. And then, of course, the state, this poses problems because it's kind of overt. But then you come up with an ideology supporting, why it's okay. Like I said, the pharaohs will say that the sun won't come up and the Nile won't flood. In Mesopotamia, usually there's some kind of claim that some deity, Marduk or Nandi or somebody, has justified their rule. Usually they had to do some kind of, they would sacrifice or something to the guy. If you go to like Mesoamerica, this is really obvious, where the royalty would sacrifice their blood, like they would do bloodletting, not just captives but themselves. Say this is what keeps Kukulkan happy and prevents him from eating the sun. If you ever watch Apocalypto, they depict that very well, I think. So all this is to say, states are not required for organization. They're not required for civilization or urban existence. We have examples of society existing without it. I think it's something that it is natural in the sense that it isn't imposed from outside, but nothing is in humanity. But it's also not required, and it's not something that's automatic either. We don't see states just automatically everywhere there's ever a group of people. It's something that gradually develops. And I think once you get the first states, you start to see emulation on the part of other areas, where they, other elites say, well, I mean, it's pretty soon after Uruk and Ur that everybody else around them starts fancying themselves the king of so-and-so, rather than just the arbiter of so-and-so, or shaman or of whatever. So I guess there's a whole other thing you could say, the tribal chieftains or whatever. I think that's a little bit more ambiguous. Usually tribal chieftains are not legislators, and they don't have the authority that states typically do, but I guess there's some room for debate there. But anyway, those are my thoughts. If anyone's really interested in history, this is an excellent series so far anyway. I don't think you'll find anything more comprehensive on the topic, and I don't know. I think it's the beginning of history, so it warrants a lot of study. So, all right, that's it.